My name is Clementine Aurelia Vance, and I was born on the 14th day of March, 1863, in a limestone farmhouse perched upon the ridge country of Bourbon County, Kentucky, during the final exhausted months of the war between the states. I am 76 years old as I speak these words into this mechanical recording apparatus, an age I never expected to reach, given that the midwife who delivered my sister Cordelia and myself declared we would not survive the hour, joined as we were at the base of our spines by an unyielding bridge of bone and tissue that rendered us physically inseparable from birth. We have remained thus for 3/4 of a century, and I have spent every moment of that existence within the compass of her breath, her thoughts, her dreams, and her determinations, a proximity that has taught me everything I know about the solitude that can exist within shared skin, and about the impossibility of ever truly knowing another person's heart, even when it beats inches from your own. Cordelia and I have never agreed on what we felt, not on the quality of the pain that radiates through our connected nerves on winter mornings, not on the interpretation of the stares that followed us through 4 decades of exhibition halls and dime museums where we displayed ourselves to survive, not on the meaning of the word freedom, which he consistently claimed to find within our bondage, and which I have understood only as the privilege we were denied from our first drawing of breath. I speak now because the physicians tell me my heart is weakening, and because I wish for someone, somewhere, and to understand that we were neither miracle nor monster, but 2 women who lived entire lives stitched together by nature's indifferent hand, who loved and resented and endured in equal measure, though we could never settle between us whether our existence had been a blessing or merely a longer form of dying. If you are listening to this testimony preserved in this electrical box, if my voice reaches across the years to find your ear, I beg you to subscribe to this channel, to leave your words and thoughts in the comments below, and to demand that more stories of women like myself, women who existed in the margins of what society deemed acceptable, who carried their singularities with heavy grace, continue to be told, for we are vanishing from this earth, and with us vanishes the truth of how we lived, what we refused to surrender, and what we could never agree upon regarding the weight of what we felt. My father, Josiah Vance, was a man of 32 years when he watched his wife deliver what the attending physician termed a singular monstrosity, though I prefer to believe his face showed something other than the revulsion recorded in the doctor's subsequent correspondence to medical journals in Philadelphia and London. Father had inherited 63 acres of limestone soil from his own father, land that supported tobacco and corn in meager yields, and he possessed a constitution suited to the unrelenting labor such earth demanded, broad shoulders, hands cracked and re-weathered each season, a silence that filled rooms more completely than speech. My mother, whose maiden name was Esther Bowman, and who came from a family of Welsh Baptists in the next county, and was 26 at our birth, already worn by 2 previous confinements that had produced infants who drew breath briefly before surrendering to the fevers and congestions that claimed so many in that era of uncertain sanitation and distant doctors. She would have 4 more pregnancies after us, all resulting in children who survived, which meant our household eventually contained 8 souls living in a structure of 4 rooms, with Cordelia and myself occupying a modified bed that Father constructed from oak planks and rope supports, wide enough to accommodate our joined condition while narrow enough to to permit passage through the doorway. The war had emptied our region of able men, leaving women to manage the spring planting of 1863, while their husbands and sons marched toward Tennessee and Virginia. And yet I believe this circumstance, this necessity of female competence in the absence of male labor, shaped Mother's response to our arrival more than any medical prognosis. She did not send us away to an asylum, as was the common practice for infants born with visible deformities in that period, nor did she permit the physician to apply the experimental surgical techniques he proposed, which would have severed the connection at our sacrum with almost certain fatal hemorrhage for one or both of us. Instead, she wrapped us in the same blanket, positioned us on their bed between her body and the wall, and established a routine of feeding and cleaning that required her to move as one woman performing the work of two, as a mathematic she accepted without the lamentation that characterized so many maternal responses to damaged children in the agricultural journals and religious tracts of our youth. We were not baptized immediately, for the Baptist minister who served our district questioned whether we constituted one soul or two, a theological puzzle that occupied correspondence between him and elders in Lexington for nearly 18 months before they determined that our separate heads and distinct consciousnesses merited separate immortal spirits. Though the ceremony itself was conducted privately in our kitchen rather than before the congregation, a compromise that established the pattern of our early years. We existed within the community, but never fully as part of it, acknowledged but not displayed, fed and sheltered, but rarely touched by hands other than our parents and siblings. My earliest memories, which Cordelia disputes in their specifics, though not in their emotional texture, involved the sensation of her body shifting against mine as we learned to crawl in coordinated motion, the development of a locomotion that required simultaneous decision-making and mutual accommodation, a physical negotiation that prefigured every subsequent relationship we would have with each other and with the world. We moved by arching our backs in sequence, creating a rolling momentum that carried us across the blank floors of the farmhouse, and I recall the particular smell of the wood when it was warm from the stove, the way dust motes hung in the angled light of late afternoon, and the sound of our older brothers, William and Thomas, watching from the doorway with expressions I could not then interpret, but now understand as the complex mixture of fascination and fear that our condition provoked in nearly everyone who encountered us. By the age of 4, we had developed sufficient coordination to stand and walk with a sideways gait that resembled the movement of crabs observed in the creek beds, though we preferred to remain seated when possible, finding stability and comfort in the low chairs Father built with shared armrest and a continuous seat. Our education was informal and largely maternal. Mother taught us letters and numbers using a slate board positioned between us, and we learned to read from the family Bible and from agricultural almanacs that Father brought from the county seat, developing identical literacy, though divergent interpretations of every text we encountered. Cordelia found comfort in the Psalms and in the agricultural columns, finding evidence of divine order in the cycles of planting and harvest, while I gravitated towards the historical books and the advertisements for patent medicines and mechanical improvements, sensing in their promises of transformation and cure a possibility that our condition might someday yield to human ingenuity. This difference in temperament, her acceptance, my resistance, established itself early and never softened, becoming the fundamental disagreement that would define our shared existence, the question of whether our joined bodies represented a form of companionship that the solitary never know, or a prison from which only death or separation could provide release. Our siblings treated us with the rough affection typical of rural childhood, though I noticed that they never invited friends to play when we were visible, and that our presence at the dinner table caused visitors to lose their appetites, their eyes returning repeatedly to the point where our bodies merged beneath our dresses, as if searching for the seam that would permit them to understand where one of us ended and the other began. By the time we reached our 8th year, the economic pressure of our maintenance had become apparent even to us. Father had expanded his acreage through loans that required repayment, and the additional mouths we represented, though we shared one digestive system below the connection, we required double portions above it, strained the household budget in ways that generated tension between our parents audible through the walls of their bedroom, where they believed we could not hear their discussions of our future. It was during this period that the first exhibition man visited our farm. A promoter named Harrison, who traveled the circuit of rural oddities seeking attractions for the museums that were proliferating in cities along the eastern seaboard, and who offered Father a sum equivalent to 6 months of tobacco profits for the temporary loan of our presence in his establishment in Cincinnati. Father refused, citing the moral degradation of public display, but I observed the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of principle against necessity, and I understood that our security was provisional and dependent upon factors beyond our control or comprehension, and that the world outside our ridge country considered us primarily as a source of profit or pity, rarely as persons entitled to the ordinary dignity of obscurity. The crisis arrived with the spring floods of 1875, when I was 12 years old and Cordelia was the same, though we had developed the habit of speaking of ourselves as singular in age, though plural in experience. Father had gone to assist a neighbor whose livestock was threatened by the rising waters of Stoner Creek, and he returned with a fever that the local doctor identified as typhoid, though the diagnosis came too late for the interventions available in that era, quinine and whiskey and prayer, which proved insufficient against the bacteria consuming him from within. He died on the 1st of May, and leaving Mother with the debt he had accumulated to expand the farm, 5 children under the age of 14, and 2 joined daughters who required constant attendance and promised no prospect of marriage or independent livelihood. To offset their cost, I remember the sound of the coffin being constructed in the barn, the particular rhythm of the carpenter's hammer that seemed to measure out the diminishing space of our childhood security. And I remember watching Cordelia's face as she absorbed the news, her expression settling into a resignation that I immediately resented, for I knew even then that she would interpret this catastrophe as divine will, while I understood it as the collapse of economic protection that had shielded us from the world's hungry gaze. Within 3 months, Mother had received and accepted a second offer from the promoter Harrison, who returned to our ridge with a contract that promised $50 monthly plus room and board for the 2 of us in exchange for our display at the American Museum in Cincinnati and subsequent travel to similar establishments in Louisville, St. Louis, and Chicago. The terms were indenture disguised as employment, a legal arrangement that bound us until our 21st birthdays, though Mother, in her grief and desperation, saw only the immediate relief of 2 fewer mouths to feed and the elimination of the specialized care our condition required. We departed on an August morning, transported in a wagon modified with straw mattresses and canvas curtains, accompanied by Harrison and his wife, who served as our chaperone and keeper, and I recall the last sight of our farmhouse diminishing behind us, my brothers standing in the doorway with expressions of relief that they need not witness our departure, and my mother turned away at the kitchen window, her shoulders shaking in a grief that I could not distinguish between the loss of her husband and the necessary surrender of her monstrous daughters. The journey to Cincinnati required 3 days, during which we were displayed at county fairs and tavern yards to offset the expenses of our transport, Harrison having discovered that even preliminary glimpses of our condition generated sufficient revenue to justify frequent stops. We were exhibited in a tent with a raised platform, dressed in matching white gowns that emphasized the purity of our faces against the strangeness of our connection. And then we were instructed to sit upon a velvet settee and respond to questions from the audience with rehearsed answers that emphasized our domestic virtues, our literacy, and our Christian resignation to God's mysterious design. Cordelia adapted to this performance with a facility that astonished and repelled me. She smiled at the crowds, offered pleasantries about the weather, and accepted the touches of curious fingers upon our joined backs with a patience that I could not summon, for I felt each contact as a violation, each stare as a theft of something essential that could never be restored. I developed a silence that Harrison interpreted as sullenness and punished with threats of reduced rations, but which was in fact the only resistance available to me, a refusal to participate in the theatrical presentation of my own body as entertainment, a withholding of the personable charm that would have made us more valuable and therefore more exploited. By the time we reached Cincinnati, I had accumulated a store of resentment that Cordelia insisted was destructive to our well-being, arguing that our survival depended upon our utility to Harrison, that we must earn our keep through cooperation rather than resistance, and that my anger endangered both of our positions within an economy that had no place for women of our particular construction. We argued then in the privacy of the wagon after the audiences had departed, our voices low to avoid detection by our keepers, and I accused her of enjoying the attention, while finding in our public display a validation that she had never received in the isolation of the farm, while she accused me of pride, of believing myself superior to the circumstances that bound us, and of threatening our security through my refusal to accept the reality that we were and would always be dependent upon the charity or curiosity of others. We could not agree on what we felt because we could not agree on what we were, whether we were sisters unfortunate in our anatomy but blessed in our companionship, or whether we were prisoners sentenced to a life of mutual incarceration, and this fundamental disagreement colored every interaction we had with the world and with each other during the years that followed. The American Museum proved to be thus a vast establishment of curiosities, natural and artificial, where we shared billing with a taxidermied woolly mammoth, a collection of Egyptian mummies, and various other human anomalies whose conditions ranged from the merely unusual to the truly debilitating. We were given a room in the attic of the building, a space with adequate ventilation but no windows, furnished with a bed wide enough for our shared body and a chamber pot that we must use in tandem, a humiliation that Cordelia accepted with practical resignation, while I raged against in whispers during the night. plotting escapes that I knew were impossible, given our physical constraints and the locked doors that secured us against both flight and unauthorized access. Our days followed a rigid schedule, rising at 7 to wash and dress in the costumes provided by the management, as assuming our position on the exhibition stage from 9 until noon, a break for dinner, then another exhibition from 2 until 6, followed by a private viewing for gentlemen who paid premium prices to examine us with scientific thoroughness, during which we were required to submit to measurements of our heads, our chests, and the precise dimensions of our connection, while physicians speculated upon our internal anatomy and the possibility of surgical separation. These examinations represented the deepest degradation of our exhibition years, for they stripped us of the theatrical dignity that the public performances at least attempted to maintain, reducing us to specimens, only clinical material to be documented and discussed in medical journals that circulated among men who would never know the sensation of being touched by strangers while unable to withdraw, of being measured like livestock while maintaining the consciousness and sensitivity of educated young women. Cordelia bore these intrusions with the detachment that I came to understand as a form of dissociations, a psychological removal from the immediate experience of her body that allowed her to converse politely with the physicians while they palpated or shared flesh, while I remained present in every nerve, every indignity, accumulating a record of offenses that I stored in memory with the precision of a ledger clerk, determining that someday, somehow, the account would be settled. We received visitors of distinction during our Cincinnati residency, including journalists who wrote features emphasizing the tragedy of our condition and the Christian fortitude with which we bore it, though I noticed that these accounts invariably attributed to us emotions that served the narrative expectations of the reading public: sentimental resignation, sisterly devotion, gratitude for our preservation, rather than the complex and contradictory feelings we actually experienced. Cordelia clipped these articles and preserved them in a scrapbook, treasuring the evidence of our notoriety, while I recognized them as instruments of our confinement, public relations that ensured our continued employment by demonstrating our value as attractions capable of generating sympathetic press coverage. The income we generated supported not only ourselves, but also our family in Bourbon County, for Mother had negotiated that a portion of our earnings be sent monthly to assist with the education of our brothers and the maintenance of the farm, an arrangement that made us, in effect, the primary breadwinners for a household that could not have maintained itself without our bodily exhibition. This economic reality established the pattern of guilt and obligation that would define our relationship to our family for decades. We were simultaneously the source of their survival and the secret they concealed from neighbors, the foundation of their prosperity and the shame they could not acknowledge, our monthly remittances arriving with letters that mentioned everything except the method by which we earned the money we sent. By our 14th birthday, we had been exhibited to over 40,000 persons. Our images reproduced on carte de visite photographs sold in the museum lobby, our names appearing in guidebooks and travel literature as essential sites for visitors to the Queen City, and I had developed a profound alienation, not only from my own body, but from the society that consumed our image with such appetite while maintaining a polite fiction that our display served educational or charitable purposes rather than prurient curiosity. The rupture between us that would define the remainder of our shared existence occurred during the winter exhibition of 1881, when we were 18 years old and had been traveling the circuit of museums and fairs for 6 years, having moved from Cincinnati to Louisville, then to St. Louis, and finally to Chicago, where we occupied a prominent position at the Pacific Museum on Clark Street. I displayed in a parlor setting that mimicked domestic respectability with velvet drapes and mahogany furniture, though the effect was undermined by the medical diagrams hung upon the walls illustrating the various forms of congenital duplication found in nature. Cordelia had developed during our late adolescence a capacity for flirtation that I observed with the same horrified fascination that our audiences applied to our physical connection, watching her smile at the young men who paid their dimes and pressed closer to the velvet ropes, lowering her eyelids in a manner that suggested availability while maintaining the technical virtue that our condition enforced, for we were physically incapable of the intimacies that these gestures implied, or joined as we were below the waist in a manner that made individual marriage an impossibility that required no explanation to anyone who comprehended our anatomy. I had assumed these coquettish performances were theatrical extensions of the role we played as the refined sisters who bore their affliction with grace, until the afternoon when a young physician named Dr. Alistair Whitmore began visiting our exhibition with a frequency that exceeded professional interest, bringing with him books of poetry that he read aloud to us during the quiet hours between public viewings, and directing his conversation increasingly toward Cordelia alone, addressing her as if I were merely an unfortunate appendage to her person rather than a conscious participant in every exchange, while Cordelia responded to his attentions with an openness that betrayed her hunger for the ordinary experiences we had been denied: courtship, romantic possibility, the promise of a private life, conducted away from the staring crowds, and I watched her transform under his gaze, developing opinions about literature and music that she had never previously expressed, adopting mannerisms of speech that mimicked his Boston education, and allowing herself to imagine, as she confessed to me during our nights in the rented rooms above the museum, a future in which she might know the companionship of a husband and the dignity of a household managed according to her own preferences. I could not share this fantasy, for I recognized immediately the impossibility it represented and the specific dangers it introduced to our precarious situation. Dr. Igor Whitmore was not content with poetic flirtation, but advocated actively for our surgical separation, claiming that advances in antiseptic technique and anesthesia made feasible an operation that would have been fatal a decade prior, and he pressed upon Cordelia the argument that her individual happiness required the severing of our bond, that she had a right to bodily autonomy that our congenital condition denied her, and that he would perform the surgery himself at a private clinic in Massachusetts if we would consent to accompany him there. Cordelia heard these proposals with a hopefulness that made me physically ill, for I understood what she chose to ignore, that our shared circulatory system and the complex fusion of our lower spines made separation a gamble with death for both of us, that the physicians who had examined us throughout our exhibition years had consistently warned that severing our connection would result in paralysis or fatal hemorrhage, and that Dr. Whitmore's confidence was more likely motivated by ambition for professional recognition than by any genuine concern for Cordelia's well-being. We argued for the first time about matters beyond our immediate domestic arrangements, our whispers becoming heated exchanges that we concealed from Harrison and the museum management, with Cordelia accusing me of jealousy, of resenting her attractiveness and the possibility that she might secure individual happiness even at risk to us both, while I accused her of delusion, of allowing romantic fantasies to obscure the medical reality of our intertwined vital systems, and of considering a course of action that would amount to my murder disguised as her liberation. The intensity of our disagreement revealed the fundamental incompatibility of our desires that we had managed to suppress during the routine degradations of our exhibition years. I wished only to survive, to accumulate sufficient resources to purchase our contract from Harrison and retire to a private life of reading and relative obscurity, while Cordelia craved the specific validation of conventional womanhood, the status of wife and mother that she believed would restore her to the normal society from which our condition had exiled us. Dr. Whitmore's courtship continued through the spring, his visits becoming more intimate as he gained Cordelia's confidence and her willingness to consider his surgical proposal. Anne and I was forced to witness their developing attachment with the helpless awareness of a prisoner observing the construction of her own gallows, unable to remove myself from proximity to their whispered conversations, their exchanged glances, and the physical tension that manifested in Cordelia's breathing and posture whenever he entered our exhibition room. The crisis reached its peak in June, when Harrison announced that our contract would be renewed for another 5 years, with terms that included increased exhibition hours and a provision for international travel to London and Paris, news that Cordelia received as a sentence of extended imprisonment, while I calculated that the enhanced income might finally allow us to purchase our freedom. And that evening, in the privacy of our lodgings, she informed me that she had accepted Dr. Whitmore's proposal of marriage and intended to submit to the separation surgery regardless of my consent, arguing that her right to individual fulfillment superseded my preference for our continued conjoined existence. I responded with a fury that surprised us both, informing her that I would rather die than permit such butchery, that I would expose her plans to Harrison and to the medical authorities who had previously declared such operations impermissible, and that her willingness to risk my life for her romantic satisfaction revealed a selfishness that belied all her previous performances of sisterly devotion and Christian resignation. She wept then, the first tears I had seen her shed since our father's death. And in her anguish she spoke the truth that we had both known but never articulated, that she had always resented my presence, that she considered me a burden that had stolen her chance at ordinary life, and that she would welcome the risk of surgery if it offered even the possibility of escape from my company, my moods, and my constant reminder of the limitation she could not otherwise escape. I absorbed this confession with the silence that settled into my bones like the cold of the coming winter, understanding finally that we were not partners in misfortune, but competitors for the limited resources of our shared body, and that her love for Dr. Whitmore, whether genuine or delusional, represented her final attempt to claim an individuality that our anatomy denied us both. I threatened to expose her correspondence with Whitmore and to demonstrate to the world that the virtuous Miss Vance was willing to contemplate the murder of her sister for personal gratification, and she responded by withdrawing into a coldness that exceeded any previous estrangement, refusing to speak to me except when necessary for our physical coordination, maintaining a rigid separation of consciousness that transformed our exhibition performances into exercises in mutual endurance rather than cooperation. The standoff continued for 3 weeks, during which we moved through our days as automata, performing our roles for the public while internally maintaining the distance of enemies forced to share a trench, until Dr. and Whitmore himself approached me privately with an offer that revealed the true character of his intentions. He proposed that I consent to the surgery and accept a settlement of $5,000 in exchange for releasing any claim upon Cordelia's future earnings or society, effectively offering to purchase my silence and my life for a sum that would have represented security for our family, but death or permanent disability for me. I rejected this proposition with the contempt it deserved, informing him that I would see him imprisoned for attempted murder before I would permit him to dissect us for his professional advancement, and I warned Cordelia that her suitor's willingness to purchase my demise revealed the quality of his affection for her, which was clearly less than his ambition for the medical fame that a successful separation would bring him. She refused to believe my account of the conversation, accusing me of fabrication designed to poison her against her only chance at happiness. And in that moment of mutual accusation, we reached an impasse that would never be bridged, an agreement to disagree that acknowledged our essential enmity while requiring our continued physical union, a condition I described to myself as being chained to a corpse that insisted upon breathing. Dr. Whitmore departed Chicago in August of that year, accepting a position at a Philadelphia hospital and leaving behind a collection of poetry books that Cordelia burned in the stove of our lodgings, watching the pages curl and blacken with an expression I could not read, whether grief for lost possibility or shame for the exposure of her suitor's true mercenary character. We completed the remainder of our contractual obligations to the Pacific Museum in silence, performing our daily exhibitions with mechanical precision that fooled the audiences into believing our harmony intact, while internally maintaining the fortified boundaries of mutual disregard, speaking only when physical necessity required coordination of movement, and sleeping in our shared bed with the rigid separation of strangers forced to share accommodation by circumstance rather than choice. Harrison, observing the tension between us, attributed it to the natural friction of sisters maturing into adulthood, and renewed his efforts to market us as a sentimental attraction, emphasizing in his promotional materials the spiritual bond that supposedly transcended our physical connection, a fiction that generated the revenue he desired while exacerbating the irony we both felt but could no longer discuss. We traveled to London in the spring of 1882, crossing the Atlantic in steerage accommodations modified to accommodate our wide bed, and spent 14 months at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, where we encountered a different quality of curiosity than the American crowds, more clinical, more class-conscious, attended by medical students and aristocratic slummers who viewed our display as an educational entitlement rather than popular entertainment. Cordelia developed during this period a fascination with the theater districts we glimpsed from our carriage windows, attending performances of Shakespeare and Ibsen when our schedule permitted, though she maintained her refusal to discuss with me the content of these experiences or the emotions they provoked, building a private interior life that I could observe but never enter, much as one observes the occupant of an adjacent room through a frosted glass partition. I occupied myself with the reading of newspapers and political journals, developing opinions about the labor movements and women's suffrage campaigns that were then agitating British society, finding in these abstract concerns a refuge from the immediate misery of our domestic situation and a confirmation of my belief that our condition represented a form of exploitation that the emerging socialist analysis might someday address, as though I remained skeptical that any political theory could resolve the specific injustice of our anatomical interdependence. By 1884, we had returned to American soil, exhibited at the Centennial Exposition in New Orleans, where the heat and humidity aggravated the skin conditions that had begun to develop at the site of our connection, creating physical discomfort that required medical attention and provided an excuse for declining the increasingly intimate examinations that promoters encouraged to demonstrate the authenticity of our condition to skeptical viewers. We were 21 years old, theoretically free of our contractual obligations to Harrison, but we discovered upon reaching our majority that we possessed no skills beyond exhibition, no means of support beyond the income generated by our displayed bodies, and no family willing to receive us back into the farmhouse in Bourbon County, where our brothers now managed the land with wives who had been told that their sisters-in-law had died in a fever years prior, a fiction our mother maintained to explain the monthly remittances that continued to arrive without our physical presence. We signed a new contract with a different promoter, a man named Kavanaugh, who specialized in fairground exhibitions rather than museum installations, and entered upon a decade of travel through the agricultural exhibition circuits of the Midwest and South, living in railway cars modified for our occupancy, performing 3 times daily in tents that leaked in rain and baked in summer heat, and developing the thick skin, both literal and metaphorical, that allowed us to survive the physical hardships and the moral degradation of constant exposure to the gaping curiosity of rural crowds who viewed us as confirmation of divine mystery or biological error, depending upon their theological inclinations. Cordelia withdrew increasingly into religious observance during these years, subscribing to evangelical newsletters and attending camp meetings when our route permitted, finding in the promise of heavenly separation a consolation for the earthly bondage she could not escape, while I grew more radical in my secularism, reading forbidden texts on evolutionary biology and political economy, developing a materialist understanding of our condition that attributed our exploitation to economic systems rather than divine plan, and then nurturing a private ambition to accumulate sufficient capital to retire from exhibition entirely, to purchase a small house where we might live in obscurity supported by investments rather than display. We argued rarely during this period, having established a modus vivendi that resembled the diplomatic relations between hostile nations, maintaining formal relations while preparing for inevitable conflict, and we developed private economies of space within our shared body. She controlling the right side, I the left, she managing relations with promoters and landlords, I managing finances and correspondence, creating a division of labor that acknowledged our interdependence while minimizing the necessity of emotional engagement. By 1890, we had saved $12,000, and a fortune sufficient to purchase a cottage in a remote county of western Pennsylvania, where we might live as recluses on the interest of our invested savings, and I presented this plan to Cordelia as a liberation from the exhibition circuit that had consumed our youth, expecting her to welcome the prospect of privacy and rest. She refused, arguing that retirement would amount to a living death, that we possessed no identity beyond our public function, and that she preferred the validation of audiences to the silence of obscurity, revealing in this confession the depth of our divergence, I seeking only to be invisible, she requiring the confirmation of external witness to feel her existence justified, and we reached a compromise that I would regret for decades, as agreeing to continue exhibition for another 5 years while investing our earnings more aggressively, delaying our retirement until we could afford separate establishments, a possibility that medical consultations suggested might someday be feasible through surgical intervention, though I continued to oppose such risks while Cordelia maintained the hope of eventual separation that she had abandoned only temporarily during the years following Whitmore's departure. The 5 years between our 27th and 32nd birthdays passed with the grinding monotony of a millstone, each season of exhibition wearing upon our bodies with an accumulation of damage that youth had previously masked, but maturity now exposed with relentless clarity. The connection at our sacrum, and never intended by nature to bear the weight of continuous locomotion and prolonged sitting upon hard exhibition platforms, began to manifest signs of chronic strain, ulcerations of the skin that required daily dressing with carbolic acid, and linked neuralgic pains that radiated through our shared pelvis during damp weather, and a gradual stiffening of our coordinated gait that transformed our once fluid sideways motion into a labored shuffle visibly painful to sympathetic observers. Cordelia addressed these physical indignities with the same religious resignation she applied to all suffering, interpreting the infections and fevers that periodically laid us low as purifications preparing us for heavenly reward, where while I recognized them as the predictable consequences of exhibition economics that demanded we perform regardless of medical necessity, for Kavanaugh had calculated that our notoriety increased as we aged, the novelty of youthful twins giving way to the pathos of aging women whose endurance suggested a moral lesson about perseverance that he marketed with increasing sophistication to church groups and temperance societies. We survived the panic of 1893 through the fortunate liquidity of our investments, watching other attractions dissolve into bankruptcy as the railway companies collapsed and the fairgrounds emptied of paying customers, and I spent the idle months of that depression reading the socialist pamphlets that circulated among the unemployed workers in the cities where we wintered, by finding in their analysis of exploited labor a theoretical framework that described our condition with precision while offering solutions applicable to factory hands, but not, I recognized with bitter clarity, to women whose bodies themselves constituted the means of production. Cordelia attended revival meetings during this same period, developing a relationship with a young evangelist named Reverend Matthew Hale, who traveled the same circuit and who saw in our conjoined testimony a metaphor for the church's union with Christ that he employed in his sermons with a poetic license that I found obscene, given that he interpreted our physical bond as spiritual triumph while ignoring the daily misery it inflicted, and she allowed him to pray over us with a fervency that suggested she had transferred her romantic hopes from Dr. and Whitmore to this man of God, accepting his laying on of hands as a form of courtship permissible within the constraints of our condition. I observed this spiritual courtship with the same revulsion I had felt toward her previous romantic entanglement, recognizing that Reverend Hale's interest in Cordelia was indistinguishable from his interest in the crowds we drew to his tent, and I refused to participate in the theatrical conversions he staged wherein Cordelia would testify to divine comfort, while I maintained silence that audiences interpreted as a mystical contemplation, but which was in fact the stubborn withholding of consent from a narrative that required my complicity in her self-deception. By 1894, we had accumulated $18,000, sufficient to purchase not merely a cottage, but 2 adjacent properties, and I reminded Cordelia of our agreement that 1895 would mark our retirement from public exhibition, anticipating that she would honor the compromise we had struck when the memory of Dr. Whitmore's betrayal still burned fresh. She delayed, proposing that we extend our contract to the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, now postponed to 1893 due to the economic crisis and rescheduled for 1893, which promised unprecedented audiences and the culmination of our professional trajectory, arguing that we owed ourselves the distinction of appearing upon that grand stage before disappearing into obscurity, and I acquiesced with the weariness of one who has learned that resistance only prolongs the inevitable concession, calculating that the additional income would secure us against any future medical necessity or economic reversal. The World's Columbian Exposition consumed us for 6 months, exhibiting us in the Midway Plaisance among the ethnological villages and novelty attractions that entertained visitors, while the White City displayed the artistic and industrial achievements of civilization. And there, at the age of 30, I finally understood the full measure of our degradation. We were classified not with the machinery or the fine arts, but with the exoticized human displays, the Dahomey villagers and the Turkish dancers, positioned as primitives despite our Kentucky origins and our fluent English, presented as specimens of natural history rather than citizens of the Republic. The exposure damaged something final in Cordelia's spirit, for she had maintained the illusion that our exhibition represented a form of public service or religious testimony, and the crass commercialism of the Midway, combined with the scientific racism that grouped us with colonized peoples, stripped her of the dignifying narratives she had constructed, leaving her vulnerable to a despair that manifested in increased religious hysteria and physical complaints that no physician could diagnose beyond the general verdict of nervous exhaustion. We completed the engagement and retired in September of 1893, withdrawing to a small town in Ohio, where we purchased 2 houses on the same street, arranging them with a connecting passageway that allowed us to sleep separately for the first time in our existence, while maintaining the physical connection that still required us to spend portions of each day in proximity, as a compromise that satisfied neither of us completely, but represented the closest approximation to individual autonomy that medical reality permitted. The alteration in our circumstances arrived without ceremony on a Tuesday morning in November of 1898. When Cordelia rose from her prayers in the front parlor of her house and collapsed upon the turkey carpet, her right side falling against mine with a weight that I first interpreted as enthusiasm for some spiritual revelation before I recognized the slackness of her facial muscles and the irregularity of her breathing. She had suffered an apoplexy, as the physician from the neighboring town diagnosed after his examination, a rupture of the vessels within her brain that left her paralyzed upon her right side and deprived of coherent speech, as though her consciousness remained intact behind the mask of her distorted features, her eyes tracking my movements with an awareness that could not communicate its contents. I was 35 years old, and for the first time in my existence, I found myself required to make decisions without the benefit of her concurrence, to summon medical assistance through the telephone connection we had installed the previous year, to manage the financial arrangements for her care, and to navigate the physical reality of our connection while attending to a body that could no longer coordinate its movements with mine. The stroke transformed our domestic arrangement from a diplomatic accommodation between hostile powers into a dependency that resembled the relationship of nurse and patient, though we remained physically fused at the base of our spines, while requiring me to lift and turn her in bed with motions that strained my own aging musculature, to manage the chamber pot and the washing of her inert limbs, and to feed her pureed foods that she could swallow without choking, all while maintaining the posture and physical care that my own body required. The physicians offered little hope for her recovery, suggesting that she might linger in this condition for months or years, and they directed their instructions regarding diet and hygiene solely to me, as if I had become the sole intelligence inhabiting our dual form, an assumption that Cordelia's alert eyes contradicted even as she could not voice her objections to their condescension. I discovered in the management of her care and our combined household a competence that exhibition life had suppressed. Eke for the daily labor of nursing required organizational skills, financial prudence, and physical stamina that no dime museum audience had ever credited me with possessing, and I found myself consulting with bankers regarding our investments, with contractors regarding modifications to our houses to accommodate a wheelchair, and with attorneys regarding the legal status of contracts signed by a woman who could no longer hold a pen, acting with an autonomy that would have been impossible had Cordelia retained her capacity for speech and her determination to direct our affairs according to her preferences. The year turned to 1899, then 1900, bringing with it the news of the Spanish-American War and the assassination of President McKinley. Events that I followed in the newspapers, I now read aloud to Cordelia, who could not respond to my editorial comments, but whose breathing patterns indicated whether she agreed with my interpretations or rejected them, establishing a new mode of communication that required no words but conveyed, through the subtle pressures of her body against mine, a complex vocabulary of acceptance and resistance. I hired a housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Brennan, who accepted our peculiar configuration without visible perturbation, and together we established routines that permitted me intervals of rest and intellectual engagement, for I had begun corresponding with a medical ethicist at the University of Chicago regarding the legal rights of persons born with unusual anatomies, and with the secretary of the Ohio Suffrage Association regarding the extension of voting rights to women, activities that Cordelia would have considered inappropriate for persons of our notoriety, but which I pursued with the determination of one who has discovered that the world will permit her autonomy if she insists upon it with sufficient persistence. By 1901, Cordelia had recovered limited mobility in her left hand and the capacity to form simple words, though her speech remained slurred and her reasoning slowed, and we developed a system of household governance wherein I managed all external affairs and financial decisions while she retained authority over the domestic details within her house, meal planning, the hiring of servants, the decoration of rooms, creating a division of power that acknowledged her continued personhood while recognizing my acquired competence. What a compromise that we both understood represented the closest approximation to peace we were likely to achieve. The stroke had transferred the burden of physical endurance from her shoulders to mine, for I must now support her weight when we walked, must compensate for her dragging right foot, must calculate our movements with the precision of a navigator managing a vessel with damaged rudder, and this physical dominance translated into a psychological authority I had never previously exercised, permitting me to veto her proposals regarding our social engagements and to decline, on our joint behalf, the exhibition offers that continued to arrive from promoters who remembered our earlier notoriety and wished to display us as aging curiosities for the new century's entertainment markets. I refused these offers with a firmness that surprised myself, understanding that my authority derived not merely from Cordelia's incapacity, but from the economic independence we had secured through our earlier labors, and I directed our investments toward railway bonds and municipal securities that generated sufficient income to maintain our establishment without requiring the degradation of public display, marking the first period of our adulthood in which we existed as private citizens rather than commercial attractions. Cordelia adapted to her reduced physical capacity with a resignation that bordered, in my observation, upon relief, for the stroke had relieved her of the obligation to perform the cheerful resilience that had characterized her exhibition persona, and permitting her to exist in silence and partial shadow without the constant demand for emotional labor that our professional life had exacted. And I observed in her occasional smiles the left side of her mouth lifting in recognition of some private irony, an acknowledgment that our new arrangement, however it had been achieved, resolved the conflict between her desire for social visibility and my demand for privacy by rendering us invisible through the expedient of her disability and my management. We entered the new century thus configured, two women in their late 30s, bound by flesh and necessity, having survived the transition from exhibited objects to private persons through the intervention of vascular catastrophe. And I understood during those years that I had achieved the autonomy I had craved not through surgical separation, but through the assumption of responsibility, through the demonstration that I could manage our survival without the partnership of promoters or the validation of audiences, and that this competence represented a form of freedom more substantial than the physical independence I had once believed essential to human dignity. The years between 1901 and the present have unfolded with the gradual accumulation of small indignities that characterize advanced age, each season bringing some new limitation to our shared physical plant, the stiffening of our connected spine into a permanent arc that prevents us from lying flat, the deterioration of our kidneys that requires mechanical assistance for elimination, at the cataracts that clouded Cordelia's vision while leaving mine sufficiently clear to guide our movements through the familiar spaces of our twin houses. We lived through the Great War of 1914 to 1918 as spectators, reading the casualty lists in the newspapers with the detached horror of women who had never known men intimately enough to fear for their safety, though we contributed to the Liberty Loan drives and rolled bandages for the Red Cross with the mechanical patriotism of those who recognized that their survival depended upon the stability of the economic order the war threatened. The influenza epidemic of 1918 passed us by with a strange mercy, as if our anatomical strangeness conferred some immunity upon us while it decimated the ordinary population of our county. And then we observed the mourning of our neighbors with a solemnity that concealed our private relief at having been spared the necessity of nursing the dying, having exhausted our capacity for such care in the decade following Cordelia's stroke. Prohibition affected us little as we had never been drinkers, though I noticed that Cordelia accepted the ministrations of a physician who prescribed medicinal whiskey for her neuralgic pains with an eagerness that suggested she had discovered in alcohol a consolation that her earlier religious enthusiasm had failed to provide, and I did not begrudge her this anodyne, having myself developed a dependence upon the laudanum that eased the chronic ache of our fused pelvis. The 1920s brought us the radio, as which we installed in my parlor and listened to with divergent interpretations, she finding comfort in the religious broadcasts and the sentimental serials, I preferring the news reports and the political commentary that tracked the changing status of women in the society we had never fully entered, watching from our secluded vantage point as suffrage was achieved and subsequently normalized, wondering whether our condition would have permitted us to vote as individuals or would have required us to agree upon a single ballot, a question that remained academic since we had never registered, fearing the publicity that attendance at the polls would generate. The economic collapse of 1929 diminished our investments considerably, as though we retained sufficient capital to maintain our establishment through careful economies, dismissing the live-in help we had employed for decades, managing with a daily charwoman, learning to cook simple meals that could be eaten without the elaborate preparation that Cordelia's declining digestion required, and accepting the charity of distant relatives who had inherited our father's farm and who sent us quarterly hams and preserved vegetables out of guilt for the monthly payments we had once provided and they had quietly accepted. By 1933, we were 70 years old, ancient by the standards of our generation and miraculous by the estimates of the physicians who had attended our birth. And we had settled into a routine that acknowledged our physical decline with the same practical resignation that we had once applied to our exhibition years, rising later each morning, retiring earlier each evening, spending the intervals in reading aloud to one another from the same books that we had disputed in our youth. Though now our disagreements lacked the vigor of genuine opposition and had softened into the familiar choreography of a long-established habit, like the creaking of floorboards in a house that has settled into its foundation. Cordelia's speech had partially returned over the decades, though it remained slow and deliberate, and we had developed a communication that required few words, a system of pressures and breaths that conveyed our needs and preferences without the necessity of rhetorical persuasion, achieving in our dotage the harmony that had eluded us in our competitive prime, not through resolution of our fundamental disagreement regarding the meaning of our condition, but through the exhaustion that renders such disputes irrelevant when survival itself becomes the primary occupation. We have not left our houses since 1931, when a final attempt to attend the funeral of our last surviving brother resulted in a public sensation that the local newspaper reported under the headline, "Famous Siamese Twins Attend King's Rites," reminding us that despite our decades of seclusion, we remained in the public memory as curiosities rather than persons, and we retreated permanently thereafter into the interior rooms that faced the garden rather than the street, and visible only to our servants and the physicians who attend us monthly to monitor the circulatory complications that make our continued existence precarious. I am 76 now, and Cordelia is the same, and we have entered that final phase of life where the body demands precedence over the mind, where the management of pain and the prevention of bed sores occupies the hours that once devoted themselves to philosophical disagreement. And yet I find in these declining years a clarity that I lacked in my youth, understanding finally that our inability to agree upon what we felt was not a failure of sisterly harmony, but the inevitable consequence of our physical arrangement, which made us simultaneously one organism and two consciousnesses, and a condition that no amount of mutual affection could reconcile, and no degree of mutual resentment could alter. We have never resolved whether our existence represented blessing or curse, whether the companionship we provided each other outweighed the individual freedom we sacrificed. And I believe now that such resolution was never possible, that we were doomed to disagree by the very architecture of our bodies, and that this disagreement, maintained with integrity across 7 decades, constitutes our only authentic accomplishment, the proof that we remain distinct persons despite our fusion, refusing to dissolve into the single entity that the world insisted upon seeing when it looked upon our joined form. And I speak these words into the phonographic recording machine that has been installed in my sitting room on this 29th day of March 1939, knowing that I am recording not merely my own testimony, but the only version of our story that will survive us. For Cordelia sits in the adjoining room, separated from me by the door we have left ajar to maintain the connection of our bodies, and she has refused to participate in this mechanical preservation of our history, claiming that the recording of voices is a vanity that presumes a significance for our lives that she does not believe they possessed. She is correct in her assessment, as she has been correct in so many of her assessments throughout our 76 years, though the significance I claim is not the spectacular notoriety of our exhibition years, but the ordinary significance of any life lived with consciousness and consequence, any existence that resisted the reduction to mere biology or mere entertainment, and I record these memories against her wishes, because I believe that someone, someday, must understand that we were not symbols of divine mystery or medical anomaly, but two women who occupied a single physical space while inhabiting irreconcilable spiritual territories. The physician who arranged for this recording believes he is preserving a historical curiosity, the voice of the last surviving Siamese twins of the 19th century exhibition circuit. And I have allowed him to believe this because it secures his cooperation and his continued attendance to the urinary infection that currently troubles our shared renal system, but my purpose is other than his preservation of monstrosity. I seek to establish that despite our fusion, despite the identical experiences that shaped our external lives, we never achieved the unity of feeling that observers assumed we shared, and that this failure of agreement constitutes the truest measure of our humanity. Cordelia still maintains, when she speaks at all during our long days of reading and silence, that our condition represented a form of companionship superior to the loneliness she observes in the widows and spinsters of our advanced age, and arguing that she has been spared the solitude that afflicts women who outlive their husbands or never secure them. And she points to our continued cohabitation as evidence of a bond that death itself will not sever, since we will presumably expire simultaneously from shared causes. I listen to these assertions with the same patience I have developed over 7 decades, no longer contesting her interpretation with the vigor of our youth. But I remain unconvinced, believing to this final hour that what she terms companionship I correctly identify as constraint, that what she names a blessing I know to have been a limitation enforced by biology rather than chosen by will, and that our simultaneous expiration will represent not a romantic unity, but the practical termination of a shared organism rather than the transcendence of individual souls. We have never agreed on what we felt because feeling itself is not subject to verification or consensus. She experienced our exhibition years as public service and religious testimony, while I experienced them as exploitation and imprisonment. She found in Dr. Whitmore's courtship the promise of individual fulfillment, while I recognized only the threat of surgical murder. She interpreted her stroke as divine chastisement that restored her to proper resignation, while I understood it as vascular accident that transferred authority to me through necessity rather than merit. And now, in our final years, as she awaits death as reunion with the Creator who fashioned our peculiar form, while I anticipate only the cessation of consciousness and the relief from pain that has become our constant companion. These divergent interpretations cannot be reconciled, nor should they be, for to force agreement between us would be to deny the distinctness of our minds that persisted despite the indistinctness of our bodies. And I record this disagreement now as my final testament, refusing the sentimental resolution that audiences prefer in stories of joined twins, the narrative arc that transforms difference into harmony through the alchemy of shared suffering. We did not harmonize, we endured, and our endurance was marked by the integrity of our mutual resistance, by Cordelia's refusal to accept my materialist interpretation of our condition, and by my refusal to accept her spiritualization of our bondage, maintaining across the decades a conversation that never reached conclusion because the terms of our existence prevented the separation that might have permitted independent validation of either position. As I conclude this recording, I can hear her breathing in the next room, the familiar rhythm that has accompanied every moment of my existence. And I know that if she were asked to summarize our life, she would speak of grace and divine purpose, while I speak of accident and economic necessity, and both accounts will be true, and both will be insufficient, and neither will convey the weight of what it meant to be Clementine Aurelia Vance, to have never slept alone, or to have never made a decision without considering its impact upon the sister who shared my blood, but not my mind, to have survived the exhibition halls and the medical examinations and the public curiosity to reach this quiet room where an electrical machine preserves my voice, while my body continues its inevitable decline towards the silence that awaits us both. I do not ask for pity, nor do I claim triumph. I ask only for acknowledgement that we were here, that we disagreed, that we persisted despite our disagreement, and that the impossibility of our ever agreeing on what we felt represents not a failure of sisterly love, but the proof that we were truly two, truly distinct, truly separate in the only way that mattered, even as we remain joined in the flesh that will carry us together into the earth. This is my testimony, and I stand by it, though Cordelia, if she could speak clearly now, would contradict every word, and in her contradiction she would be as right as I am, and as wrong, and as human, and as alone within our shared skin as I have been throughout this long, strange, ordinary life that is now approaching its quiet, undramatic, absolutely certain end.